The curved greatswords are like regular greatswords, instead they're actually curved, meaning that they're actually dexterity based weapons because everybody knows if it's straight, it's strength, if it's not straight, yeah, you get the idea. But curved greatswords are actually really good in every single game. They tend to get very good DPS, nice range, good speeds, good stagger potential. The only things that they tend to really be lacking in is that they're dexterity based weapons that tend to have higher strength requirements, so there actually might be a lot of wasted stats when trying to build around them. And compared to greatswords, they might have better DPS, but they definitely lack in variation of movesets. For the most part, they tend to just get a bunch of horizontal swipes. Whereas if you compare them to greatswords, they'll tend to get horizontal swipes, vertical chops, and sometimes even poking attacks. Now, yes, as always, we did an entire marathon playing every single Souls game, using every single curved greatsword. We did those runs live on Twitch. And now we're going to be ranking all of them from worst to best based on how well they perform inside of their own game. So meaning, if it's good in its own game, it's going to get higher on the list. If it's average in its own game, it's going to get lower on the list. And this is just going to take PvE into account. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Not even sure if that even makes a difference in saying that, but yeah, let's just get into it. Starting off at the bottom with the worst curved greatsword in the entire Soul series, we have the Monk's Flameblade, which this one is from Elden Ring, and curved greatswords in this game are actually really good, and you'll probably find plenty of success with the Monk Flameblade, but the reason why this one is going to get at the bottom is because there's literally no reason to use this over any other curved greatsword in this game. It gets the least amount of base damage out of the ones that can be infused, gets some of the worst range, gets the same requirements, the exact same moveset, which all of this is perfectly fine if it was like accessible earlier in the game, but this curved greatsword is one of the last ones that you actually can acquire. Basically, almost every other curved greatsword that can be infused can be acquired earlier than this one, and those ones are just going to get more damage and have more range. The only thing that I could say that's positive about this one is that it is going to be one of the lighter curved greatswords. In fact, out of all the curved greatswords that can be infused, this one actually is the lightest, but it's only by like 1 unit. The Dismounter just weighs 1 more unit and just does more damage and has more range and have like less requirements too. So you're better off just going with that one. I don't know why this thing just didn't get bleed or actually get a unique moveset at all, especially because this one is like the worst one to try and farm. There's only like 1 enemy in the entire game that actually drops it. Has like a 2% drop rate and it's like in this really annoying dungeon. Number 20, the Onyx Lord's Greatsword, another curved greatsword from Elden Ring, and this one is just useless because it gets some of the worst damage, it gets an average range, the exact same moveset as all the other curved greatswords. It does get a somewhat okay strength and intelligence-based scaling, but there are plenty of other strength and intelligence-based weapons that just get more damage and can perform a lot better, because this weapon skill, Onyx's Lord Repulsion, is basically just a reskinned version of Gravitas, which Gravitas itself is kind of like a weaker type of weapon skill. It is not that good, it's more situational than anything. But this one actually might prefer a little bit more because it does do more damage and do a little bit more stance damage. But the trade-off being is that it's a slower animation and it consumes like twice as much FP. This thing consumes 27 FP, which is way too high for how much damage this thing does. There are plenty of other skills in this game that consume way less FP and can do way more damage. Number 19, the Dark Souls 3 Murakumo. Now, Dark Souls 3 curved greatswords are also really good. Nice speeds, good range, good stagger potential. They actually get pretty decent variety in movesets. Nice horizontal swipes with the one-handed and two-handed light attack combo. The heavy attack is a nice downward slam too. And the weapon arts of the curved greatswords in Spin Slash is very high damaging, good stun locking potential, not that expensive. I think my major problem with it though is that it consumes a lot of stamina. You need to have a lot of endurance just to be able to roll after you actually use the entire combo. But the reason why the Murakumo is going to get lower on the list is because this one just gets some of the worst damage. And also compared to all the other dexterity based curved greatswords, this one actually gets the highest strength requirement at 20 strength. So it's going to have the most amount of wasted stats there too. But yeah, all this would be perfectly fine if it was just accessible earlier on in the game. But you get this one later than like almost every other curved greatsword on the game. Number 18, we have the Server from Dark Souls 1, and curved greatswords in this game are also really good. The only downside that I could say about these weapons is that they all tend to be dexterity based with really high strength requirements. And with the Server, that is no exception. It gets a 24 strength requirement and gets an A scaling in strength, and also does only get a B scaling in dexterity, which is probably the reason why it's going to get lower on the list, because it just gets the worst range and the worst damage out of all the other curved greatswords. Also gets the lowest durability too. Now, the positive things I can say about this is that it does tire for the lightest curved greatsword, and it also does give you HP on every single hit, but it's like 7 HP for every single hit, which is basically nothing, especially if you're using like a slower type of weapon like a curved greatsword. If this was like on like a straight sword or a curved sword, rapier, I'd probably like it a bit more. And also you do get this weapon relatively early on in Blightstown, but you get all the other curved greatswords earlier in the game as well, and those ones are just better. Number 17, we have the Beastmans cleaver, which is also from Elden Ring, and this weapon actually does scale primarily off strength, which is really nice because a lot of these curved greatswords have higher strength requirements, so having a scaling to go alongside with that is pretty cool. Now this weapon also gets some of the highest base damage and actually can outdamage most of the other curved greatswords in the game. It actually does outclass all the ones that can be infused as well, but unfortunately I still wouldn't really care to use it much because 1, it's the heaviest curved greatsword in the game by an actual decent margin, and 2, it gets some of the worst range as well, which I don't mind the fact that a weapon could be like really big and thick and actually weigh the most, but at least have some of the most range too, because the damage isn't that much more to where it's worth using over the other options. And another annoying thing, this thing doesn't get a unique moveset. I don't know why it didn't get a cooler heavy attack, something similar to like what the Beastmen use in some cool lunging heavy attack. That would have been nice, but it just gets the same moveset as all the other curved greatswords. So yeah, this weapon actually gets too many downsides to where it's not really worth using, despite it actually getting the most damage out of the entire class. I mean, at least out of all the ones that can be infused, because it still doesn't get as much damage as a Bloodhound's Fang, but you know, not many things do. Number 16, we have the Dark Souls 2 Murakumo, which Dark Souls 2 curved greatswords are just once again really good in this game as well. Now typically when using them, I just think the one-handed movesets are just way better than the two-handed movesets, because something about the two-handed movesets I don't like. The speeds are not that good. The way that it swings, it kind of goes like more diagonal vertical than like diagonal horizontal. It's kind of hard to explain, but like against smaller types of enemies, there's plenty of times that it's like went directly over their head and just like straight up missed. I don't know, I didn't like it. I found much more consistency with the one-handed combos, but the damage itself can be really nice. The poise damage is really good. Unfortunately, they tend to be a lot heavier in this game compared to all the other games with the curved greatswords. And another thing I don't really care for is that they tend to get lower counter damage, only at 110, which almost all other dexterity type weapons just tend to get higher counter damage. But for the most part, they can perform perfectly fine. Now, as for the Murakumo, this one actually can get some of the highest base damage out of all the curved greatswords. Its scalings aren't too bad. Actually is the lightest curved greatsword too, with the lowest strength requirement. But once you end up putting a bit of points into strength or dexterity with a particular type of build, the other curved greatswords are just going to outdamage it, which wouldn't be too big of a deal if you could get the Murakumo a lot earlier in the game, but you can get the Arc Sword literally earlier than the Murakumo, and that one could just perform way better. Number 15, the Omen cleaver from Elden Ring. This is another curved greatsword that can be infused. Does scale equally well with either strength or dexterity. The damage is pretty decent, the range is pretty good as well. But the reason I'm not going to value it that much is because I think the Dismounter is still going to outclass it. It probably doesn't get as much damage, albeit it's like 10 AR difference. But the Dismounter just gets more range and it gets the better moveset, because the Omen cleaver heavy attack, I do not like it. It used to be really good back when the curved greatsword heavy attacks were like just slower in general, of which this attack was a lot faster than the other ones. But ever since the curved greatsword heavy attacks got buffed, those regular horizontal heavy attacks just come out almost as fast as like the downward chop that you get with the Omen cleaver. And if the speeds are very similar nowadays, I don't really care much to get that downward chop slam, because the range is just not that good. And it also works the exact same way with the jumping attack too. There's so many times that you just like fall short of the enemy, and it's having the regular jumping attack and the regular heavy attack is just going to work way more consistently. So it is pretty decent and you can find plenty of success with it, but I just think the Dismounter is just going to be the better option nowadays. Number 14, we have the Old Wolf Curved Sword, which is from Dark Souls 3. This one is going to be a dexterity, somewhat quality based of weapon. Cannot be infused, it cannot be buffed. The base damage actually can be relatively high, although all the other curved greatswords that can be infused or buffed can just outdamage this thing. But it still has a few things going for it. One, it actually does get the passive effects of the Pontiff Rings just passively put onto it. So with successive attacks, you just get more damage and some health regen. But unfortunately, you have to hit an enemy like 3 or 4 times until you actually see the benefits of this. But the fact that you can just get more health regen and just more damage itself is still going to be nice. But the reason why it's going to get lower on the list, in my opinion, is because its weapon art does leave a lot to be desired. Wolf Leap is some like cooler looking attack, does some nice retreating animation after you finish the combo. Very reminiscent of the Bloodhound Fang weapon skill. But the difference being is that the Bloodhound Fang actually does good damage. This one does not. It is going to be very situational. I'd only really use it if there's going to be an enemy that's doing some like AoE attack that you kind of want to dodge while you attack yourself and just retreat back into safety, because the damage output is just not that good and not worth the 25 FP in my opinion. It's probably going to be something more for like PvP, because the light attack does true combo into the weapon art. But yeah, in a PvE setting, it is not going to be that good. Spamming R1 is just always going to be much more optimal. And the fact that this is actually a Covenant reward doesn't really help it much either. Number 13, we have the Harald curved sword, which is one of 2 strength-based curved greatswords in Dark Souls 3. Doesn't get that good of damage, nor that good of range. Almost all the other curved greatswords are probably just going to outdamage it. But one thing that this actually does do better than the rest is probably just have the better weapon art, because its weapon art is Sever, which actually does a bunch of these flurry attacks, which honestly do not do good damage, but against smaller types of enemies, it is just going to stun lock them, and you can just hold onto the button and just constantly hit them over and over again. And you have the option of a follow-up attack that does this big-ass downward slam, and this downward slam actually does do some nice damage. So it can definitely trivialize a lot of the encounters against these smaller types of enemies, but unfortunately the damage output and the range is not good enough for it to be higher on the list. Number 12, we have the Curved Dragon Greatsword from Dark Souls 2. Now, this weapon actually is going to be the heaviest Curved Greatsword in the entire game. It does get the highest strength requirements too at 30 strength, despite it scaling primarily off dexterity. Although going into a little bit of strength is still going to net you some rewards because it does get a C scaling in strength, but that S scaling in dexterity is definitely going to help carry it. This weapon also does get some of the worst range, if not the worst range out of the entire class. But the reason why it's still going to get this high on the list is because it gets a unique heavy attack, which is basically a projectile. And this projectile actually is very good. Does some nice damage, goes through enemies, goes pretty far. And projectiles in this game can definitely trivialize a lot of encounters. And the fact that you can just get a nice damaging projectile without having to spec into faith or intelligence is really nice. And the fact that it travels in like some nice horizontal spread means it actually can hit multiple enemies at once and actually does knock them back and send them flying, which is really good. But it is going to have one major downside in that it consumes a lot of durability. It consumes 10 durability for every single heavy attack, and you only get 60 durability for the entire weapon, which means that you're gonna have to probably use the bracing knuckle ring and stack up on a bunch of repair powders, which is very inconvenient. This constantly having to spam repair powders throughout the fight can be tedious, but your reward is this really nice projectile. Number 11, we have the Arc Sword from Dark Souls 2. Now this one I just consider to be just a direct upgrade of the Murakumo. Basically gets the exact same range, same movesets, similar weight, does get a bit higher of requirements for strength, but its scalings are just going to be way better to where you're just going to get more damage with the Arc Sword. I think once you get to about 20 or 30 dexterity, or if you're just going to a quality type of build, the Arc Sword is just going to outdamage it. You do also get it a lot earlier on, but being that it is actually a boss weapon, trying to find some petrified dragon bones earlier on can be kind of annoying. So in that instance, you probably could just go with the Murakumo instead, but the Arc Sword does have a higher upside. Number 10, we have the Carthus Curved Sword from Dark Souls 3. Now this one I just consider to be a better version of the Murakumo because it weighs less, you can get it earlier in the game, has just as much range, gets a lower strength requirement, and the damage is very similar. The Murakumo can probably just outdamage it by like 10 to 20 AR, but the Carthus Curved Sword actually gets bleed, which bleed in this game is very solid. A lot of enemies are weaker to it, and it is just going to result in a bunch more damage against a lot of different enemies. And in terms of its weapon art, it gets also Spinning Slash, but it's a different version of Spinning Slash. Instead of doing that horizontal swipe, it actually gets the vertical chop, which the vertical chop actually comes out a lot faster. It still consumes a lot of stamina, just like the other Spinning Slash, but this one just feels a lot more smoother to use due to its speed. I probably still wouldn't want to use it over the Exile Greatsword, because that one's just going to get more damage, but being that this one is a lot lighter, has lower requirements, and does get bleed, it is going to have its own specific use. Number 9, we have the Dismounter from Elden Ring, and I consider this one to be the best one that can be infused. Doesn't get like the highest damage, but it does get some of the most range, and it just gets the best moveset as well. Those heavy attacks just come out really fast, nice horizontal swipe. The follow-up attack can also do some very high amounts of stance damage. It's also going to be one of the lightest curved greatswords on the game, with some of the lowest requirements too. So if you're just looking for a nice, reliable curved greatsword that you can acquire early in the game, you can just use the Dismounter, although, you know, there's going to be better options that you can get with the curved greatsword category. Number 8, we have the Zamor curved sword, also from Elden Ring. Now, this weapon only gets this high because of its weapon skill, Zamor Ice Storm, which I consider this to be an absolute S-tier weapon skill. This thing is absolutely incredible. This AoE attack can do upwards of 45 to 50 stance damage in a very quick animation, only consumes 15 FP, does over 600 frost buildup, which means that almost every single boss in the entire game is just going to get frostbitten in just one attack. And with how quick the animation is and how quickly you can roll out of it, you can spam it over and over again. I honestly think this thing is probably the best curved greatsword skill in the entire game. But unfortunately, the weapon itself is straight up fucking trash. It gets the worst range out of all the curved greatswords by a lot. It gets the worst base damage, gets some of the worst scalings, and it gets the worst moveset too. That light attack combo is terrible. It's like a slower version than like the regular light attack combo, and the hit detection is just way worse. And the way that it swings, it makes the weapon like have even worse range somehow. It just doesn't lunge very far. I honestly think that regular curved swords get more range than this thingy. The only positive thing that I can say about it is that it can be on the lighter end. It's still not even the lightest curved greatsword in the game. The Morgotts is literally lighter. But like that's the only other positive thing I can say about it. Because also another annoying thing is that you get it later in the game of a very annoying dungeon. But yeah, the only reason it gets this high is because the weapon skill is godlike. It really is. Number 7, we have the Gravelord sword from Dark Souls 1, which is going to be one of the better, if not like the best early game option in the entire game. A lot of people consider it to be the best weapon in the entire game. I don't know why. All the other curved greatswords can just out-damage it when paired alongside certain types of buffs, and even once you get to about 20 or 25 dexterity, the Murakumo is just going to out-damage it outright, even without any buffs. Because yeah, the Gravelord sword just gets really, really bad scalings. You get like E scaling in strength and dexterity, and you can't really improve it much at all. But the reason I'm going to value it as a really good early game option is because it gets immensely high base damage. At +0, it gets 265. And being that this weapon actually does require Demon Titanite, it can be pretty easy to get this thing to +2 or +3, like almost right at the beginning of the game. But once you get later on in the game, you're just better off switching to the Murakumo because it's just going to get more damage, and it's going to just require regular Titanites to upgrade, which is just going to be much easier and more manageable compared to just killing a bunch of Titanite demons. And also that weapon can be buffed. But some other positives that the Gravelord sword does have is it gets toxic as a status effect, which is just going to be some nice damage over time. Unfortunately, a lot of bosses in this game are just immune to a lot of status effects, including toxic, so it's not going to be that useful, although against some enemies it is obviously going to be a benefit. And this thing actually does get the best moveset as well, which is probably the main reason why I'm putting it this high, because its heavy attack is actually a poking attack, which funnily enough, this is the only curved greatsword in the entire series that actually gets a thrusting poking attack, which obviously poking attacks are really good because counterattack damage exists. It could result in more damage. Paired alongside the Leer ring, it can result in really good damage. So this thing can very well carry you from start to finish. If you are a newer player, I kind of recommend going with this weapon itself because it doesn't require you having to spec into much strength or dexterity. You could just meet the minimum requirements, go all into your health, all into your stamina, and you can still get a pretty decent damaging option. Although if you did want to focus on damage, the Murakumo alongside a plethora of other weapons in this game are just going to perform better. Number 6, we have the curved Nil Greatsword, which I consider the best curved greatsword in Dark Souls 2. Not only can this get some of the highest damage, some of the best scalings, but it also does get the best moveset. And it also just looks the coolest too. Like this thing is just badass. But yes, to start off with, it actually does primarily scale off the strength stat. Can actually get an S scaling in strength. Even with multiple different types of infusions, it still retains an S scaling. Just leaving it with a standard path. It also gets a B scaling in dexterity. So going into a quality build, it is very viable. And it can end up having some of the highest base AR compared to all the other curved greatswords. And in terms of its moveset, its two-handed light attack combo I'm going to much prefer over the regular two-handed light attack combo because the speeds are somewhat similar, but it just gets more of a horizontal swipe, which is just much better for hit detection because like the weird vertical chops that the other curved greatswords get are just not that good. And with how annoying the tracking and redirection is in Dark Souls 2, trying to hit with vertical chops can be extremely obnoxious, so having horizontal swipes are just much more reliable, and its heavy attack is a really cool spin to win. The stamina cost isn't that friendly, but the damage output is just undeniable. Now, one downside that I can say about this weapon is that it cannot be buffed, so you will start to notice that your damage output is not going to be that good, and you wish it was a bit better, but this thing actually does get the special effect of doing more damage with every single new game iteration, which honestly, if you're going to be using this weapon, it's probably going to be a new game plus and beyond anyway, because you do get it in the last DLC. And also this does scale all the way up to new game plus 9, so as high as you want to go, it's just going to get amazing damage. Now, I would say, I don't know why there's not more weapons like this in the other games, but you know, the other games don't have any cool new game plus, so I don't think I'd really care for it, honestly. Number 5, we have the Morgotts Curse Sword, which is an Elden Ring curved greatsword. And this one is absolutely incredible. Its damage output isn't going to be like the greatest thing, doesn't get the highest amount of base damage. Its scalings could be better. It doesn't get a B scaling in dexterity, although it does only get a D scaling in arcane. But thankfully, it does actually get an arcane scaling in a way to actually improve its blood loss build up, which the fact that it does get bleed is automatically going to make it very good. And also this weapon actually is the lightest curved greatsword in the entire game, weighing in only at 7.5 units. And it also just gets the most range as well, which obviously that's really good to be the lightest and the longest. But arguably the best thing about the weapon is going to be its weapon skill, Cursed Blood Slice. For 20 FP, you do this very nice lunging attack that leaves this cool little blood flame trail, and for an additional 20 FP, you do like another pirouette swinging blood flame attack, and the entire combo can just result in really high amounts of damage. Now for 40 FP, it can be on the higher end, but if you do end up fighting enemies that are weaker to bleed, this thing can just absolutely decimate them and just make those experiences really easy. And also the entire combo can do some okay amounts of stance damage. It's not going to be like the greatest amounts of stance damage. You're probably going to stance break more if you just use it with your heavy attacks, which I definitely recommend that you do, because this weapon also does get 110 crit, which is just going to be higher than all the other curved greatswords. You're just going to get bonus damage with your critical attacks with this thing. So I probably would have liked it if the arcane scaling was a bit better and if the FP costs and requirements weren't as high, but it still is going to be an S tier weapon in this game. Number 4, we have the Magma Worm Scalesword, which this thing can be an absolute high damaging machine. It gets a really good strength and faith-based scaling, of which it can actually result in some of the highest, if not the highest amount of AR out of all the curved greatswords. It is going to be on the heavier side, weighing in at 15 units. And it also does get the Omen cleaver heavy attack moveset, which I don't really care for. I would have rather just the regular heavy attack moveset. But the weapon skill is just going to be the best part about this weapon, because Magma Guillotine for 20 FP, you do this really cool jumping attack that comes crashing to the ground in this cool lava AoE. And in this animation, you're basically like never going to get staggered out of it. You get like infinite hyper armor, do amazing damage. And for an additional 10 FP, you do this follow-up attack. And this follow-up attack can do like monstrous amounts of damage. And for only 30 FP, this thing can shred everything in the entire game. In terms of damage and stance damage too, because the entire combo can actually hit for roughly 50 stance damage. And it just will leave a lava pool on the ground. So if enemies are standing inside of it, that's just even more damage. Now, the only downside of which I can say about this thing is that it is going to be a bit harder to hit. You have to be at closer range to really benefit. And against enemies that do move around a whole bunch, you're probably going to trade out more times than not. But with how much damage this thing actually does do, you probably end up winning the trade. Number 3, we have the Dark Souls 1 Murakumo. I consider this one to be just like a top 10 weapon in Dark Souls 1. Has a really solid moveset. Those follow-up light attacks can be really good. Get a nice downward slam with the heavy attack. You get some really high amounts of AR, of which you can just outdamage all the other curved greatswords. It can be buffed, doesn't weigh that much, has some really solid range. I think the only downside of which I can say about it is that it does have a 28 strength requirement and doesn't scale well with strength at all. It is definitely going to be a dexterity-based weapon. So if you're going to be using this with a dexterity-based build, you're probably not going to be speccing into much strength and you're just going to be two-handing it the entire time. But it still is going to serve as one of the better weapons in Dark Souls 1. Number 2, we have the Exile Greatsword from Dark Souls 3 to what I consider the best strength weapon in Dark Souls 3 itself, because this one actually doesn't really perform like a strength weapon, it performs like a dexterity weapon. Gets the same moveset as all the other curved greatswords with that amazing light attack combo. Those insane running attacks that just cover so much distances are just really good. Weapon has like a nice overswing so it can hit multiple enemies at once, really good hit detection. It gets an A scaling in strength and it can just output so much damage and do it at a nice range as well. Now, some unfortunate things of which I can say about it is that it is going to be the heaviest curved greatsword in the game, weighing it at 17 units. And its weapon skill, Spinning Slash, is basically the exact same thing as the Murakumo Spinning Slash, but it's just going to be more expensive for some reason. The entire combo only does consume like 1 more FP, but it's like the same animation. It still costs a lot of stamina. It just costs a little bit more FP. But not that it really matters in Dark Souls 1, because just R1 spamming is just going to be your best friend and going to be the best way to just do damage in this game. And yeah, honestly, it just doesn't get much better than the Exile Greatsword. Unless we're talking about this weapon right here, the Bloodhound Fang, the best curved greatsword in the entire series and one of the best weapons in Elden Ring itself. Not only is this a high damaging machine in this game, but it also gets bleed. It also can be buffed, despite it actually being a unique special weapon. And obviously pairing this alongside Blood Flameblade is just going to just make for an insane pairing. Or you could just go into like a damaging base buff and just get more damage than all the other curved greatswords, because for some reason it just gets really high base damage and really good scalings. Does scale primarily off dexterity, but going into a quality build is just going to be as good. And yeah, as for its weapon skill, Bloodhound's Finesse, this thing is also very high damaging, very high stance damage. The follow-up attack serves as an iframe dodge, does cover some nice distances, can stun lock enemies very nicely. It just has so many positives going for it. And the best one of all is that you get it right at the beginning of the game. I'm pretty sure this weapon is put in Elden Ring just for the beginners, just to have like a really good weapon that can carry from start to finish. Because there's nothing else that I can really think of that you just designed this weapon to have this many positives going for it. Anyway, that's now completed. Let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And also let me know what marathon you'd like to see next or what ranking video you'd like to see next. You can just let me know down in the comment section or just follow me on Twitch and just ask me the question there as well. But in terms of the next video I am going to make, it's probably going to be going over the best and worst thing for every single Souls game. It is going to be like a very personalized list. But if you are interested in that, definitely do subscribe. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.